She had spoken rather rapidly. "I can't help saying it," she said, with the quality of her voice altering, "but I do not think it is right for an unprotected girl to be in London alone as you are." "But I'm quite equal to taking care of myself, aunt." "It must be most uncomfortable here. It is most uncomfortable for every one concerned." She spoke with a certain asperity. She felt that Ann Veronica had duped her in that dream, and now that she had come up to London she might as well speak her mind. "No Christmas dinner," she said, "or anything nice. One doesn't even know what you are doing." "I'm going on working for my degree." "Why couldn't you do that at home?" "I'm working at the Imperial College. You see, aunt, it's the only possible way for me to get a good degree in my subjects, and father won't hear of it. There'd only be endless rows if I was at home, and how could I come home when he locks me in rooms and all that?" "I do wish this wasn't going on," said Miss Stanley, after a pause. "I do wish you and your father could come to some agreement." Ann Veronica responded with conviction. "I wish so, too." "Can't we arrange something? Can't we make a sort of treaty?" "He wouldn't keep it. He would get very cross one evening, and no one would dare to remind him of it." "How can you say such things?" "But he would." "Still, it isn't your place to say so." "It prevents a treaty." "Couldn't I make a treaty?" Ann Veronica thought, and could not see any possible treaty that would leave it open for her to have quasi-surreptitious dinners with Ramage, or go on walking round the London squares discussing Socialism with Miss Miniver toward the small hours. She had tasted freedom now, and so far she had not felt the need of protection. Still, there certainly was something in the idea of a treaty. "I don't see at all how you can be managing," said Miss Stanley, and Ann Veronica hastened to reply, "I do on very little." Her mind went back to that treaty. "And aren't there fees to pay at the Imperial College?" her aunt was saying. A disagreeable question. "There are a few fees." "Then how have you managed?" "Bother!" said Ann Veronica to herself, and tried not to look guilty. "I was able to borrow the money." "Borrow the money! But who lent you the money?" "A friend," said Ann Veronica. She felt herself getting into a corner. She sought hastily in her mind for a plausible answer to an obvious question that didn't come. Her aunt went off at a tangent. "But, my dear Ann Veronica, you'll be getting into debt." Ann Veronica at once, and with a feeling of immense relief, took refuge in her dignity. "I think, aunt," she said, "you must trust to my self-respect to keep me out of that." For the moment her aunt could not think of any reply to this counterstroke, and Ann Veronica followed up her advantage by a sudden inquiry about her abandoned boots. But in the train going home her aunt reasoned it out. "If she's borrowing money," said Miss Stanley, "she must be getting into debt. It's all nonsense." Part 4. It was by imperceptible degrees that Capes became important in Ann Veronica's thoughts. But then he began to take steps, and, at last, strides to something more and more like predominance. She began by being interested in his demonstrations and his biological theory. Then she was attracted by his character. And then, in a manner, she fell in love with his mind. One day they were at tea in the laboratory, and a discussion sprang up about the question of women's suffrage. The movement was then in its earlier militant phases, and one of the women only, Miss Garvice, opposed it, though Ann Veronica was disposed to be lukewarm. But a man's opposition always inclined her to the suffrage side. She had a curious feeling of loyalty in seeing the more aggressive women through. Capes was irritatingly judicial in the matter, neither absurdly against, in which case one might have smashed him, or hopelessly undecided, but tepidly sceptical. Miss Clegg and the youngest girl made a vigorous attack on Miss Garvice, who had said she thought women lost something infinitely precious by mingling in the conflicts of life. The discussion wandered and was punctuated with bread and butter. Capes was inclined to support Miss Clegg until Miss Garvice cornered him by quoting him against himself, and citing a recent paper in the 19th Century in which, Following Atkinson, he had made a vigorous and damaging attack on Lester Ward's case for the primitive matriarchate and the predominant importance of the female throughout the animal kingdom. Ann Veronica was not aware of this literary side of her teacher. She had a little tinge of annoyance at Miss Garvice's advantage. Afterwards she hunted up the article in question, and it seemed to her quite delightfully written and argued. Capes had the gift of easy, unaffected writing, coupled with very clear and logical thinking, and to follow his written thought gave her the sensation of cutting things with a perfectly new, perfectly sharp knife. She found herself anxious to read more of him, and the next Wednesday she went to the British Museum and hunted first among the half-crown magazines for his essays, and then through various scientific quarterlies for his research papers. The ordinary research paper, when it is not extravagant theorizing, is apt to be rather sawdusty in texture, and Ann Veronica was delighted to find the same easy and confident luminosity that distinguished his work for the general reader. She returned to these latter, and at the back of her mind, as she looked them over again, was a very distinct resolve to quote them after the manner of Miss Garvice at the very first opportunity. When she got home to her lodgings that evening she reflected with something like surprise upon her half-day's employment, and decided that it showed nothing more nor less than that Capes was a really very interesting person indeed. And then she fell into a musing about Capes. She wondered why he was so distinctive, so unlike other men, and it never occurred to her for some time that this might be because she was falling in love with him. Part 5. Yet Ann Veronica was thinking a very great deal about love. A dozen shynesses and intellectual barriers were being outflanked or broken down in her mind. All the influences about her worked with her own predisposition and against all the traditions of her home and upbringing to deal with the facts of life in an unabashed manner. Ramage, by 100 skilful hints, had led her to realize that the problem of her own life was inseparably associated with, and indeed only one special case of, the problems of any woman's life, and that the problem of a woman's life is love. A young man comes into life asking how best he may place himself, Ramage had said. A woman comes into life thinking instinctively how best she may give herself. She noted that as a good saying, and it germinated and spread tentacles of explanation through her brain. The biological laboratory, perpetually viewing life as pairing and breeding and selection, and again pairing and breeding, seemed only a translated generalization of that assertion. And all the talk of the Miniver people and the Widgett people seemed always to be like a ship in adverse weather on the lee shore of love. "For 7 years," said Ann Veronica, "I have been trying to keep myself from thinking about love. I have been training myself to look askance at beautiful things." She gave herself permission now to look at this squarely. She made herself a private declaration of liberty. "This is mere nonsense, mere tongue-tied fear," she said. "This is the slavery of the veiled life. I might as well be at Morningside Park. This business of love is the supreme affair in life. It is the woman's one event and crisis that makes up for all her other restrictions, and I cower, as we all cower, with a blushing and paralyzed mind until it overtakes me. I'll be hanged if I do." But she could not talk freely about love, she found, for all that manumission. Ramage seemed always fencing about the forbidden topic, probing for openings, and she wondered why she did not give him them. But something instinctive prevented that, and with the finest resolve not to be silly and prudish, she found that whenever he became at all bold in this matter, she became severely scientific and impersonal, almost entomological indeed, in her method. She killed every remark as he made it, and pinned it out for examination. In the biological laboratory that was their invincible tone. But she disapproved more and more of her own mental austerity. Here was an experienced man of the world, her friend, who evidently took a great interest in this supreme topic, and was willing to give her the benefit of his experiences. Why should not she be at her ease with him? Why should not she know things? It is hard enough anyhow for a human being to learn, she decided, but it is a dozen times more difficult than it need be because of all this locking of the lips and thoughts. She contrived to break down the barriers of shyness at last in one direction, and talked one night of love and the facts of love with Miss Miniver. But Miss Miniver was highly unsatisfactory. She repeated phrases of Mrs. Goopes. "Advanced people," she said, with an air of great elucidation, tend to generalize love. He prayeth best who loveth best.